We all do our best to try and win our fantasy football leagues. The feeling of glory and pure ecstasy when you win a championship is absolutely priceless. But winning a championship is easier said than done. You need to draft a great team, scour the waiver wire each week, and ultimately have the fantasy football gods smile down on you come playoff time. One of the ways you can greatly improve your chances of winning a title is by drafting the game-changing running back for the year, like David Johnson in 2016, Todd Gurley in 2017, or Christian McCaffrey in 2019. While it usually can be hard to figure out which of these players will have this game-changing upside, I have devised a way to make it easier to do so. It's called the Swift Formula. A few years ago, I noticed a trend among these top running backs. They were all young, dual-threat running backs that had flashed their talent the previous year. So I began playing around with some data and found that every RB1 overall since 2014 met the same 9 basic criteria. I publicly published the formula for the first time in 2019 under the name the Mixon Formula, and many of the players who made the list ended up having a successful 2019 season. I dropped the same formula in 2020, and while it wasn't quite as helpful as the previous year due to the higher ADP of the players meeting the criteria, there were still some good values. In 2021, I had to tweak the formula to adjust for the new 17-game schedule and decided to change the name to the Swift Formula. It once again had the RB1 overall on the list, Jonathan Taylor, and had produced some other values relative to ADP with guys like DeAndre Swift and Devin Singletary. So what exactly is the criteria for this formula? The criteria for the Swift Formula. Criteria number 1. The running back must be 26 or younger by the start of the upcoming fantasy year. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Running backs have a shorter shelf life than most other positions, and their per-touch efficiency generally begins to decline around age 26. The bottom line is you should be targeting a player in their physical prime. Criteria number 2. The running back must have had 32 or more receptions last year. The NFL has evolved into a more pass-heavy game. That requires top running backs to contribute in the passing game. I've set 32 receptions as the baseline because it means that the featured running back averaged around 2 receptions or more a game the previous year. Criteria number 3. The running back must have had 68 or more rushing attempts last year. This part of the criteria eliminates a few of the third down backs who don't really have a role in the rushing game and therefore cannot reach the same ceiling as other backs. 68 rushing attempts are set as the baseline because this means that in the previous year, the running back got around 4 carries per game. Criteria number 4. The running back must have had over 215 rushing yards last year. This is to make sure they at least have some talent. It's pretty difficult to not get 215 rushing yards on 68 plus carries regardless of offensive line play. Criteria number 5. The running back has played 3 seasons or less prior to the upcoming fantasy year. A player's potential can only bring them so far. If they've already played 4 seasons, they are officially a proven commodity and are unlikely to break out any further. Criteria number 6. The running back can't be on a team that drafted a running back in the first round of the most recent NFL draft. If a team takes another running back in the first round, that means that they believe that they really need an upgrade at the position, and they will typically get their shiny new toy involved in the offense. The opportunity simply won't be there for another player on the roster to finish as an RB1 if a first round back is in the fold. Criteria number 7. The running back must have only played for one NFL team. When a player gets cut or traded that early in their career, it means that an NFL team doesn't believe that they are missing out on a game-changing talent. While some players do break out after getting cut early in their careers, like Raheem Mostert, they are exceptions to this rule. Criteria number 8. The running back averaged at least 5.5 yards per reception last year. I include this metric to make sure that the running back is effective in open space, and can actually do something with their targets. A player needs talent to break out after all. Criteria number 9. The running back averaged more than 3 yards per carry last year. Similar to the above metric, this is to make sure the running back isn't completely terrible. I use 3 yards per carry as a baseline because many of the game-changing candidates that eventually broke out struggled initially and averaged under 4 yards per carry. But if you're a player that can't even get to 3 yards per carry, they aren't even worth the time. Going into the 2022 season, there are 13 players who have met all of these criteria. Jonathan Taylor, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, Javonte Williams, David Montgomery, Josh Jacobs, Antonio Gibson, Devin Singletary, Tony Pollard, AJ Dillon, Michael Carter, Alexander Madison, and Kenneth Gainwell. Let's briefly dive into each of the candidates' profiles to decide which running backs you should most frequently be targeting in your 2022 fantasy leagues. The best bets. First up is Jonathan Taylor. Saying Jonathan Taylor has a great shot of finishing as the RB1 in 2022 isn't particularly insightful. After all, he's generally the first player off the board in most fantasy leagues. But Taylor landing on this list should make it crystal clear why he's going first overall. He's a talented, young, dual-threat bell cow back who has a great offensive line and got a QB upgrade. He's the safest running back pick you can make, who also has the upside to finish as the number 1 overall fantasy back, as he did last year. The next candidate is Najee Harris. Najee Harris doesn't quite have the picture-perfect profile that Jonathan Taylor does, but there's a lot to like. He got one of the biggest workloads in the NFL last year, as he was top 3 in carries and targets for running back in 2021. If he can improve a little in the efficiency department from his 3.9 yards per carry last year, and get a few more red zone rushing attempts in 2022, he'll have a good shot at finishing as the RB1. The next guy in this elite tier is Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams is an extremely polarizing fantasy running back in the community this year, but I'm a big believer in his value. We see the stats about how good he is in terms of broken tackles and other advanced rushing statistics. He might technically be in a committee with Melvin Gordon, but new head coach Nathaniel Hackett utilizes his backs a lot more than other NFL play callers in general. I think the way that the Broncos deploy these two backs in 2022 will be a lot like the way Hackett and the Packers deployed their backs in 2019 and 2020 with Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams. It was technically a committee, but Aaron Jones was the guy finishing as a top 10 fantasy back. In this offense, I view Javonte as the new version of Aaron Jones and a solid RB1 in the improved Denver Broncos offense. The last guy that has a fantastic shot of finishing as the RB1 is DeAndre Swift. Since entering the NFL, Swift has been one of the better pass-catching backs in the league. During his rookie season, Swift caught 46 passes on 57 targets for 357 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. He built upon this performance in his second season, as he caught 62 passes on 78 targets for 452 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. I love his receiving usage and the strong offensive line, which gives him a high fantasy floor. The big concern is whether or not he'll get more red zone carries in 2022. But if he does get those red zone carries, he's a very strong candidate to finish as a top 3 back and maybe even number 1 overall. The next tier of this list is the starters with big question marks. We'll start with David Montgomery in this tier. David Montgomery is a big boomer bust candidate on this list. I'm personally leaning more towards him being a bust on this list, and believe that Khalil Herbert will have more of a role in offensive coordinator Luke Getsy's new offense. The big draw of Montgomery the past few years was that he was a bell cow, but if he loses his high usage, there's really no path for him to being an RB1 if he's a committee back on one of the worst offenses in the league on paper. I would probably avoid him on this list. The next guy in this tier is Antonio Gibson. Antonio Gibson is another guy that's a little more dicey to invest in on this list. On one hand, he played through an injury last year and still finished as a top 10 fantasy running back. On the other hand, he's got a lot more competition this year, wasn't particularly efficient as a runner, and fumbled a lot. The path for him to being a top-tier fantasy back is that he needs to hold off rookie Brian Robinson for goal line touches and figure out a way to eat more into J.D. McKissic's target workload. It's not a very likely path to a top-tier fantasy finish since he needs 2 guys to miss time or be non-factors, but I do like his odds of a top 5 fantasy finish a little more than Montgomery in this tier. The guy that rounds out this tier is Josh Jacobs. When you see a starting back play in the Hall of Fame game, it's hard not to raise an eyebrow, especially when you realize his new head coach and play caller, Josh McDaniels, has been a mixed bag in terms of rolling with a running back by committee approach or a bell cow approach. But, on the bright side, Jacobs is going to be playing in a high-powered offense, and he's finished as a top 8 fantasy back before, back in 2020. For 2022, I think he's going to split more carries than we've seen from him the past couple of years, but since he's still likely to be the goal line back in a high-powered offense, he should have a decent floor. The flex tier. There's just one player in this tier, and it's Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary is not a player that I'm too interested in this year for fantasy purposes, since he seems like more of a high floor, low ceiling type of player, given that he's likely to be operating in a heavy running back by committee approach in Buffalo once again, between himself, draft pick James Cook, Zach Moss, and pass catching back Duke Johnson. And his price isn't as cheap as it was last year. View him as a flex play and don't anticipate a major breakout from Singletary in 2022. The next tier is the elite complementary backs. First up in this tier is A.J. Dillon. My favorite draft target on this list at his current cost is A.J. Dillon because he checks off every box except for the fact that he's likely operating in a committee with Aaron Jones. He's in his physical prime. He's 24 years old, 250 pounds, and ripped. He has a running back friendly play caller, and he played at a similar level to Aaron Jones in a lot of areas in 2021. With Davante Adams gone, I anticipate that the Packers more heavily lean on the duo of Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, and figure out even more ways to have them both on the field at the same time, since those are their 2 best playmakers on offense by far. He's already shown that he can perform at a low-end RB2, high-end flex level with Jones, and if Aaron Jones ends up missing time this year, you are looking at a bona fide RB1. I'm buying him a ton at his current price. The other guy to target in this tier is Tony Pollard. From an efficiency standpoint, Tony Pollard was fantastic in 2021. I'm not quite as high on him as I am with A.J. Dillon because I think Ezekiel Elliott is more likely to stay healthy and play than Aaron Jones, since Elliott has only missed 1 game in his entire career due to injury, but it's hard to deny that Pollard has RB1 upside if for some reason Ezekiel Elliott does get hurt. He's a solid buy on this list. The last tier of this list is the Handy Handcuffs tier. We'll start with Michael Carter. Carter had a strong rookie year, but fantasy players have cooled off on him this offseason after the Jets drafted Breece Hall. The type of outcome you're hoping for if you're a Carter owner is that this ends up being a 2015 Devonta Freeman type of situation where the fans are hyped up about the rookie, but it's actually the second-year running back that takes a hold of the lead role. Do I think it's likely to happen? Probably not, but at his current cost, I like taking the shot on Carter on the outside chance it does somehow play out that way. The next guy in this group is Alexander Mattison. Mattison isn't flashy, but he gets the job done when he's in, and is one of the more valuable pure running back handcuffs in the league. Dalvin Cook has an extensive injury history, and has never played in 15 games in a single season during his career. If Cook is your first or second round pick, Mattison should also be on your roster. And if you don't have Cook and are willing to be patient with one of your bench spots, taking Mattison should pay off at some point during the season. The last guy on the list is Kenneth Gainwell. Gainwell seems to be the Nyheim Hines, Tariq Cohen of this list this year, in that I don't think he's capable of being a bell cow given his smaller build, but he could be a very sneaky play because of his pass catching potential. With his pass catching potential and the Eagles' strong offensive line, I like Gainwell a lot in PPR formats this year, especially since he cost you pretty much nothing to draft. So after looking at all these candidates, it's time to turn this into an actionable draft strategy. I'm generally planning on drafting 2 of the elite tier running backs in rounds 1 and 2 if I can. So in a 12-teamer, if I get first overall, I would be aiming for something like Jonathan Taylor and Javonte Williams. If I get a mid-first, I would be planning for something like Najee Harris and DeAndre Swift. And if I get a late first, assuming that both Najee and Taylor are gone, I would personally roll the dice on the duo of DeAndre Swift and Javonte Williams. If you don't feel comfortable doing this, you can go with the hero running back strategy and take one of them plus an elite wide receiver. Then, I would focus on the other positions for a few rounds, only taking a running back if there's a value I like at their current ADP, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a Swift Formula candidate. Once we get to the elite complementary back tier draft range, I would do my best to acquire at least one of AJ Dillon and Tony Pollard, since they have league-winning upside if Aaron Jones or Ezekiel Elliott gets hurt, and are capable of being a flex play in a pinch. And then I would plan on rounding out my draft, getting as many of the late round dual threat dart throw running backs as I can: Michael Carter, Alexander Mattison, and Kenneth Gainwell. And that's the Swift formula for 2022. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe.